Darius did not raise his voice, and that was the first thing that unsettled them. Because people who argue can be managed, but people who stay calm force you to question yourself, and no one in that cabin was ready for that. The flight attendant shifted her weight slightly, maintaining her posture but losing a fraction of her certainty as she glanced back at the waiting passenger, who now looked less patient and more expectant, as if this delay was an inconvenience he had never learned to tolerate. And that expectation filled the space like pressure, pushing everyone to resolve the situation quickly, cleanly, quietly, even if quietly meant wrongly. Darius lowered his eyes for a moment, not in submission but in reflection, because he had been here before, not this exact seat, not this exact flight, but this exact moment where someone decided what he deserved based on what they saw instead of what was true. And the memory came back sharp, precise, like a scene he never forgot. A smaller airport years ago, a younger version of himself standing at a counter while a gate agent questioned his ticket 3 times, asked for additional identification that no one else was asked to show, and then told him with a polite smile that there had been a mistake, that his seat was no longer available, that he would need to wait. And he remembered standing there watching others walk past him into the cabin, knowing something was off, but not yet having the power to do anything about it. And that moment had stayed with him, not as anger, but as a quiet promise that one day he would understand the system well enough to never be moved again. Back in the present, the trainee's voice came again, slightly stronger this time. I really did see his name in the system, but it was met with a sharper response. That is enough, the senior attendant said, her tone firm, final, designed to shut down doubt before it could grow. Because doubt was dangerous in a place built on hierarchy, and if one person questioned the decision, others might follow. A man seated across the aisle leaned forward, his brow furrowed, while a woman near the window exchanged a glance with her seatmate, both of them sensing that something was not aligning, but still unsure whether to speak, because speaking meant stepping into conflict, and most people preferred comfort over confrontation. The waiting passenger cleared his throat softly, not loudly, not aggressively, just enough to remind everyone that he was still there, still waiting, still expecting the outcome to favor him. And that subtle gesture carried more weight than words, because it reinforced the unspoken assumption that the seat was already his. Darius lifted his gaze again, this time not at the attendant but at the cabin itself, at the rows of people watching, at the silent witnesses deciding in real time what kind of moment this would become. And there was no anger in his expression, only clarity, the kind that comes when you know exactly what is happening and exactly what you are going to do next. He reached slowly into his pocket, not rushed, not defensive, just deliberate, and pulled out his phone, holding it for a second as if considering whether the moment had earned what came next, because once he made that call, things would not stay small. They would not stay contained within this aisle. They would expand beyond this cabin into systems and decisions far removed from this narrow space. And the attendant noticed the movement, her eyes narrowing slightly. Sir, using your phone right now is not permitted, she said, trying to regain control of the situation, to bring it back into the boundaries she understood. But Darius simply unlocked the screen, his expression unchanged, his voice steady as he spoke into the quiet. Then you may want to pay very close attention to what happens next. And for the first time, the certainty in the room began to crack, just slightly, just enough for doubt to slip through. The phone did not ring long, not even a full second, as if the person on the other end had been expecting the call before it was ever made. And that alone shifted something in the air, subtle but undeniable, like the cabin itself was beginning to realize this moment was not ordinary. Darius did not turn away, did not lower his voice. He simply spoke with the same calm precision that had unsettled them. From the start, "This is Cole," he said, and there was no need to explain further, no need to repeat it, because the weight of the name was not in how loudly it was spoken but in who recognized it. And on the other end a voice responded immediately, sharp, alert, "We are ready, sir." And that response, though quiet, carried a different kind of authority, one that did not belong to uniforms or badges or cabin procedures, but to something deeper, something systemic. The flight attendant heard only fragments, but even fragments were enough to make her hesitate, just slightly, just enough for the rhythm of control to falter, because this was no longer a simple disagreement over a seat. It was becoming something else, something she could not categorize within policy or training. Darius continued, his tone unchanged. Initiate a full compliance review on Horizon Air Group, Flight 721, first class cabin, and flag all active partner accounts tied to this route. And there it was. Language that did not belong to passengers. Language that belonged to boardrooms, to audits, to decisions that moved numbers most people never saw. And for a brief moment the attendant blinked, as if trying to process whether she had heard that correctly. Across the aisle, the man with the phone leaned forward further, no longer pretending to be subtle, while the woman by the window whispered something under her breath. A question without an answer, because the situation was slipping out of the simple narrative they had all assumed at the beginning. The trainee, still standing a few rows back, felt it too. That shift, that quiet realization that something important had been missed, and she looked again at the manifest on her handheld device, her fingers hovering over the screen as if the truth might appear differently this time, clearer, undeniable. The waiting passenger's posture changed, not dramatically, but enough, his confidence tightening into something less certain, because the ease he had carried into this moment was beginning to crack under the weight of what he did not understand. And for the first time, he looked at Darius not as an obstacle, but as a question. Darius ended the call without flourish, without emphasis, simply lowering the phone back into his hand as if nothing significant had happened. But everything had, because the silence that followed was no longer neutral. It was charged, waiting, like the seconds before a storm breaks. The attendant cleared her throat, attempting to regain control, to pull the situation back into familiar territory. Sir, whatever that was, it does not change the fact that this seat is not assigned to you, she said, but her voice lacked the firmness it had before, the certainty diluted by doubt she could not fully suppress. Darius looked at her again, not with anger, not with defiance, but with something colder, something more final. It already changed more than you realize, he said, and the words landed differently this time, heavier, because now the room was listening, truly listening, and in the distance, far beyond the cabin walls, systems had already begun to move. The silence did not hold for long, because doubt has a way of finding a voice, and this time it came from the back of the cabin, steady but unmistakably firm. Wait a second, the trainee said, stepping forward now, no longer whispering, no longer shrinking behind procedure, her eyes fixed on the device in her hand, as if it held something too important to ignore. His name is still in the system, she added, louder this time. And that one sentence shifted the balance more than any argument could have, because it was not opinion, it was data, and data does not care about assumptions. The senior attendant turned sharply, her composure tightening like a grip slipping on something she could no longer control. That has already been addressed, she replied, but the words felt rehearsed, thinner now, like a script losing its power the longer it was repeated, and the trainee did not back down, not this time. No, it has not, she said, holding the screen up just enough for others nearby to see. Seat 2A, confirmed, paid, and verified. And the words landed in the space like a quiet explosion, not loud, but impossible to ignore. Across the aisle, the man recording leaned even closer, his voice low but audible. You might want to listen to her, he said. And for the first time, it was not just one person speaking, it was more than one, and that was how momentum began, not all at once, but in small, undeniable pieces. The woman by the window nodded slightly, her expression shifting from uncertainty to clarity, as if something had finally aligned, while another passenger further back spoke up. If his ticket is valid, why are we still doing this? And the question hung there, simple, direct, impossible to answer without unraveling everything that had already been said. The waiting passenger shifted his stance again, his confidence now strained, his eyes moving between the attendant, the trainee, and Darius, searching for certainty and finding none, because the narrative he had walked into so easily was no longer holding together, and for the first time, he looked uncomfortable. Darius remained exactly where he had been, unmoved, his posture unchanged, but his presence now felt different, not because he had said more, but because others had begun to see what he already knew. And that was where real power started to surface, not in volume, but in recognition. The senior attendant tried again, her voice sharper now, more controlled. "We are following protocol," she said. But the word protocol no longer carried authority. It sounded like a shield, something used to deflect rather than explain, and the trainee responded immediately, almost without thinking. "Protocol does not override a confirmed ticket." And that sentence cut through everything, clean and precise, because it exposed the gap between what should happen and what was happening. The cabin was no longer quiet, not in the same way. It was alive now, filled with low voices, shifting attention, a collective awareness building in real time, and every second that passed without resolution made the situation harder to contain, harder to dismiss. Darius finally turned his head slightly, just enough to acknowledge the trainee, his expression unchanged but his eyes steady, recognizing something in her decision to speak, because moments like this did not depend on one person alone, they depended on others choosing to say something, to break the pattern. And somewhere beyond the cabin, far removed from the seats and the voices and the tension hanging in the air, systems were continuing to move, unseen, unaffected by debate or denial, and whatever had been set in motion was getting closer, faster, and none of them were ready for what that meant. The tension did not break, it tightened, pulling every voice, every glance, every unspoken assumption into a single moment that refused to resolve itself quietly. And the senior attendant felt it slipping. Control, authority, the simple narrative she had relied on just minutes ago, now fractured by doubt and witnesses who would not stay silent. So she did what people often do when certainty fades. She doubled down, stepping closer, her tone firmer, sharper. "Sir, this is your final notice. You need to stand up and clear the seat," she said. And though her words were controlled, there was an edge beneath them now, something urgent, something that betrayed the pressure building behind her composure. Darius did not move, not even an inch, his posture still grounded, his gaze steady, but something in the air around him had shifted, not visible, not loud, but unmistakable, like a current running beneath the surface that no one in the cabin could see, but everyone could feel. The trainee hesitated, caught between instruction and truth, her grip tightening slightly around the device in her hand as she looked again at the manifest, as if hoping the system would somehow align with the decision being forced in front of her. But it did not change, it did not disappear, it remained clear, consistent, undeniable, and that consistency made everything else feel wrong. Across the aisle, the man recording spoke again, this time louder, no longer careful. "This is not right," he said, and his voice carried, not because of volume, but because others were already thinking the same thing, and once a thought is shared, it becomes harder to ignore. The waiting passenger shifted again, his earlier confidence now replaced with something tighter, less certain, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked at Darius, as if trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he had assumed, and failing to do so. The senior attendant exhaled slowly, then turned slightly toward the aisle, signaling to someone just beyond the edge of the cabin, and moments later another presence approached, not aggressive, not loud, but official enough to change the tone of the situation. A uniformed staff member stepping forward with measured calm, the kind of calm that suggests resolution is coming whether it is welcome or not. "We are going to need you to comply," the man said, his voice neutral, practiced, the kind of voice designed to de-escalate while still moving things forward. But even as he spoke, the cabin did not settle, because the foundation of the decision had already been questioned, and once that happens, compliance is no longer simple. Darius turned his head slightly toward him, not confrontational, not defensive, just present, fully aware, and in that moment something older surfaced, something deeper than the cabin, deeper than the flight, a memory that moved through him not as anger but as clarity, standing in a quiet terminal years ago, holding a ticket that was questioned, delayed, dismissed, watching others pass while he remained, not because of policy, but because of perception and the realization that followed, slow but permanent, that systems do not fail loudly, they fail quietly, in moments like this, in decisions that seem small until they are not. Back in the present, the uniformed staff member extended a hand slightly, not forceful, but directive. "Sir," he said again, and Darius looked at the hand. then back up, his expression unchanged, but his voice when he spoke carried something different now. Not louder, not sharper, but heavier, as if every word had already been decided before it was said. "You are not asking me to move," he said slowly. "You are trying to correct something you do not understand." And the words settled into the space between them, not as resistance, but as a line, clear, defined, impossible to ignore. And for a moment no one moved, because the situation had reached a point where action without understanding would not resolve anything. It would only reveal more, and somewhere far beyond the cabin. The consequences already in motion were getting closer, faster, and no one in that aisle was prepared for what they had already triggered. Darius did not look at the hand in front of him again, because the moment had already moved beyond gestures and instructions and into something far more permanent, something that could not be undone with a simple apology or a quiet correction, and he understood that better than anyone in that cabin, which was why his calm had not broken, not even once. Instead, he reached for his phone again, not hurried, not dramatic, just deliberate, the kind of movement that suggested this was not a reaction, but a continuation, a step already planned before any of this began. And when he lifted it to his ear, the room seemed to tighten around the action, every eye drawn to it, every breath held just a little longer. The uniformed staff member paused, his hand lowering slightly, not because he had been told to stop, but because something in the moment told him to wait, something instinctive, something that recognized this was no longer a standard situation. "Proceed," Darius said into the phone, his voice steady, controlled, and on the other end there was no confusion, no hesitation, only immediate response. "Phase Black initiated." The voice confirmed, and though no one else could hear the full exchange, the tone alone was enough to shift the atmosphere, because it carried certainty, authority, and something else, something irreversible. The senior attendant frowned slightly, trying to reassert control. "Sir, I need you to end that call," she said, but the words felt smaller now, less effective, as if they no longer belonged in the same moment as what was unfolding. Darius lowered the phone slowly, his gaze sweeping the cabin, not searching, not questioning, just observing, as if taking in every detail before the next part began, because he knew what they did not, that the real response was not happening here, not in the aisle, not in the seats, but somewhere far beyond them, in systems that did not argue, did not hesitate, did not care about appearances. Across the aisle, the man recording whispered, almost to himself, "What did he just trigger?" And no one answered, because no one knew, not yet, but they could feel it, that shift, that invisible movement of something larger than the moment they were witnessing. The trainee looked down at her device again, and this time it was different, the screen flickering slightly, a notification appearing where there had been none before, and her eyes widened just a fraction as she read it, not fully understanding, but recognizing that it was not normal, that something had changed beyond her control. The waiting passenger took a step back, just one, subtle but clear, his earlier certainty dissolving into something closer to unease, because the situation no longer felt predictable, no longer felt safe in the way he had assumed. The uniformed staff member straightened slightly, his expression shifting as well, not fearful, but cautious now, aware that whatever authority he thought he had in this moment might not be the highest one present. Darius finally spoke again, not into the phone this time, but into the space itself, his voice calm but carrying. "You are still thinking this is about a seat," he said, and the words settled heavily, because everyone knew that was exactly what they had been thinking, exactly what they had reduced this moment to, and now that assumption was beginning to crack. Somewhere beyond the cabin, alerts were already moving, flags being raised, accounts being reviewed, decisions being queued, all of it invisible to the people standing in that aisle, but very real, very active, and very close to impacting them. The senior attendant opened her mouth to speak again, to regain control, to say something that would bring the situation back into something manageable, but the words did not come immediately, because for the first time since this began, she was no longer certain of the outcome, and that uncertainty spread, quiet but powerful, through the entire cabin, as the realization began to settle that whatever had just been set in motion was not going to end here. The shift did not announce itself with noise. It arrived in silence, in small, undeniable signals that began to ripple through the cabin like a quiet warning no one could ignore. And the first sign came not from Darius, but from the systems they had trusted without question. The trainee's device vibrated again, sharper this time. The notification no longer subtle, her eyes scanning the screen as confusion gave way to something closer to disbelief. Because the interface she had relied on was changing in real time, flags appearing, access prompts refreshing, and one line stood out in a way she could not explain, a compliance alert tied directly to the flight, to the cabin, to this moment. "This is not normal," she whispered, not to anyone in particular, but loud enough for those closest to hear. And once again the words spread, carried by attention, amplified by uncertainty. The senior attendant noticed it too, not the exact details, but the reaction, the shift in posture, the loss of quiet confidence that had once anchored her control, and she turned sharply. "What is happening on that device?" she asked, but the question already sounded like she was behind, like she was asking about something that had already moved past her. Across the aisle, the man recording leaned in further, his voice low but clear. "Something is changing," he said, and for the first time, it was not speculation, it was observation, because everyone could feel it now, the structure of the moment bending in a direction none of them had planned. The uniformed staff member reached for his radio instinctively, pressing it lightly, as if expecting clarification, but the response he received was not immediate, and that delay, brief as it was, carried weight, because systems that usually responded instantly were now hesitating, recalibrating, processing something larger than a routine cabin issue. The waiting passenger stepped back again, this time more noticeably, his earlier presence shrinking as the situation expanded beyond him, beyond the seat, beyond the simple expectation that had brought him into this moment, and his eyes moved quickly now, searching for someone to restore order, to explain what was happening, but no one had that answer anymore. Darius remained still, but his stillness was no longer passive. It was anchored, deliberate, like a center point, around which everything else was beginning to move. And when he finally spoke again, his voice did not rise. It settled, calm but absolute. "You should start paying attention to your systems," he said, and the words landed differently now, because they were no longer abstract. They were connected to what people were beginning to see, to feel. The senior attendant opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, a faint chime echoed from the front of the cabin, subtle but distinct, followed by a second, then a third, each one signaling something shifting in the background, something updating, something being overridden. The trainee looked up again, her expression no longer uncertain but stunned. "Accounts are being flagged," she said, her voice steady but quiet, as if speaking too loudly might make it more real than she was ready for, and the words moved through the cabin like a current, because even those who did not understand the full meaning understood enough to know it was serious. The uniformed staff member lowered his radio slowly, his posture changing, no longer directive but cautious, aware that whatever authority he had been operating under was now intersecting with something higher, something less visible but far more powerful. Darius looked at him briefly, then at the attendant, then at the cabin, and there was no anger in his expression, only finality. The kind that comes when a line has already been crossed, and the outcome is no longer a question but a process. "You did not misread a passenger," he said, his voice steady, each word precise. "You interfered with a financial structure that you do not control." And the sentence settled over everything, heavy, undeniable, because in that moment the truth was no longer hidden. It was unfolding, piece by piece, in real time, and no one in that cabin could stop what had already begun. The collapse did not come with shouting or chaos. It came with confirmation, quiet and absolute, like a door locking somewhere far beyond their reach. And the first voice to break through was not from the cabin, but from the front, the cockpit intercom flickering to life with a tone that was too sharp, too urgent to ignore. "We are receiving a priority compliance alert tied to this aircraft," the captain's voice said, controlled but strained in a way that made every word land heavier than intended. And the moment those words reached the cabin, everything changed, because this was no longer internal, no longer contained. It had moved beyond them. The senior attendant froze for just a fraction of a second, and that fraction was enough for everyone to see it. The loss of control, the realization that whatever had been triggered was now operating at a level she could not override, could not redirect, could not silence with policy or tone. The trainee stared at her device, her hand steady but her breathing shallow as new alerts continued to populate the screen, lines of text updating faster than she could process, account flags, compliance escalations, audit triggers all linked to the same origin, this flight, this cabin, this moment. And she spoke again, not as a question this time, but as a statement. It is locking access, and the words carried a weight that no one needed explained. Across the aisle, the man recording lowered his phone slightly, not because the moment was less important, but because it had become something else entirely, something bigger than documentation, something that demanded attention without mediation, and the woman by the window leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. This is real. As if saying it out loud made it undeniable, the uniformed staff member stepped back now, not instructed, not forced, but instinctively, his posture shifting from authority to observation, because whatever role he had been playing was no longer relevant in a situation governed by systems he did not control. The waiting passenger's composure finally broke, not dramatically, not loudly, but in the way he stepped further into the aisle, away from the seat he had expected to claim. His eyes fixed on Darius now with something entirely different from before, not dismissal, not impatience, but recognition mixed with uncertainty, the kind that comes when a narrative collapses too quickly to adjust. Darius remained exactly where he had been, seated, composed, his presence unchanged but now understood in a way it had not been moments ago. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried across the cabin without effort, steady and precise. "You did not remove a passenger," he said, and the room seemed to narrow around the sentence, every ear tuned to what followed. "You disrupted a $400 million line of capital," and the words landed with a clarity that left no room for interpretation, no space for denial, because now the scale was visible, now the consequence had a number, a weight, a reality that extended far beyond this seat, this aisle, this flight. The intercom crackled again. Another update, more urgent this time. "We are being instructed to hold position pending review." And that instruction, coming from above, from outside, confirmed everything Darius had already set in motion, and the final pieces fell into place. The authority in the cabin shifting completely, not to him in a visible way, but to the truth he represented, the system he had activated, the consequence that could not be undone. The senior attendant looked at him, her expression no longer firm, no longer certain, but searching, as if trying to understand how something so small had become something so large, and Darius met her gaze without anger, without triumph, only clarity, because for him, this was never about the seat, it was about the pattern, the decision, the assumption, and the cost that followed when those things went unchecked, and now that cost was no longer theoretical, it was real, immediate, and already unfolding. The silence that followed was no longer tense. It was settled, like a verdict that had already been delivered before anyone realized there was a trial. And no one in the cabin moved the way they had before. No one spoke with the same certainty, because everything had shifted from assumption to consequence in a matter of seconds. The senior attendant lowered her gaze briefly, not in defeat, but in realization. The kind that arrives too late to change the outcome, but early enough to understand the mistake. And when she looked back at Darius, her voice was quieter now, stripped of authority, stripped of the edge it once carried. "Sir, I think there has been a misunderstanding," she said, and the words hung there, fragile, because they could not undo what had already been done. Darius did not respond immediately, not because he needed time, but because the moment required it, the space between action and understanding, the pause where people begin to see the full weight of their choices. And around them the cabin had changed. Passengers no longer watching out of curiosity, but out of awareness, as if they had all witnessed something larger than a disagreement, something that revealed how easily a line could be crossed when no one questioned it. The trainee stepped forward slightly, her voice steady now, no longer hesitant. "His seat was never the issue," she said, not looking at Darius, but at the others. the ones who had enforced the decision without verifying it. And her words did not accuse, they clarified. They drew a line between what was done and what should have been done. The uniformed staff member stood still, his earlier posture gone, replaced with something more measured, more careful, as if he understood now that authority without awareness was fragile, and that fragility had just been exposed in front of an entire cabin. The waiting passenger said nothing, his earlier presence reduced to silence, his position in the aisle no longer one of expectation but of reflection, because whatever he had assumed when he stepped forward had been dismantled in real time, and there was no easy way to return to that assumption now. Darius finally stood, not in reaction, not because he had been told to, but because the moment had reached its end, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the cabin with a calm that felt final. "This was never about a seat," he said, and the words settled into the space like a closing statement, simple but undeniable. "It was about how quickly you decided who belongs and who does not." And no one interrupted, no one responded, because there was nothing to challenge in what had already been proven. He paused for a second, not for effect, but because the truth deserved space, then continued. "Bias does not always raise its voice," he said, his tone even, measured. "Sometimes it just follows procedure without asking why." And that sentence lingered longer than anything else, because it reached beyond the moment, beyond the cabin, into something broader, something familiar to more people than anyone was willing to admit. The intercom remained silent now, the alerts no longer new but still active, still processing, a reminder that the consequences were not theoretical. They were real, they were ongoing, and they would continue long after this. Flight landed. Darius looked once more at the people around him, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with clarity, the kind that comes from seeing a pattern play out exactly as expected. And when he spoke again, his final words were quiet but absolute. "I did not raise my voice," he said. "I raised the cost of the decision." And with that, the moment closed, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with understanding, the kind that stays long after the scene is over, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it, and neither could anyone on that flight.